In the famous words of Nelson Mandela, no one is born hating another person because of the color of their skin or their background or their religion. People must learn to hate, and if they learn to hate, they can be taught to love, for love comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposite. So here's what you can expect after the learning that's provided in this module and within Chapter 2. You will be able to identify and analyze power imbalances, and therefore understanding the need for anti-oppression frameworks that looks at these that are inherent in relationships and structures in society. You will also understand the nature and dynamics of oppression as something that's complex, it's always changing, and it's multidimensional, operating at personal, interpersonal, institutional, and cultural levels. You'll also be able to distinguish between what stereotypes are, what prejudice is, and what discrimination is, knowing that they're interrelated concepts, but they also refer to distinct things. You'll understand how forms of oppression intersect, as does privilege, and you'll explore these through something we call the ism prism. You'll also be able to look at how you can create change using the 5 practice principles of anti-oppressive practice. So in this mini lecture, we're going to take a look at what is anti-oppressive practice. We're going to take a look at what is oppression and how it's complex and multidimensional. We're going to look at stereotyping as thinking, prejudice as feeling, and discrimination as action. We're going to look at the different types and forms of discrimination and the legal protections that exist within Canada against discrimination. And we're going to look at all the different ways in which discrimination manifests itself based on aspects of people's identity and power imbalances through something known as the ism prism. And finally, how you can be an agent of social change using the 5 key principles of anti-oppressive practice. So what is anti-oppressive practice, sometimes known as AOP? It's a conceptual model that we use as an umbrella term for many different types of social justice approaches. And at its foundation, it acknowledges that both privilege and oppression, they're complex. It's not either or. It's dynamic, which means it's always changing. It's intersectional, meaning that you're not one or the other, but your identities are often made up of aspects that can both privilege and oppress. And it's multidimensional, meaning that when we look at oppression, we need to look at it at different levels. So let's begin by looking at the nature of oppression as complex. So one of the problems with oppression is that people often think you're either oppressed or you're the oppressor. And it's never that simple. That's called binary thinking. And the problem with binary thinking is it does something called othering. It creates us and them. It's a polarization of opposites. And the problem with that is that this experience of oppression is way too a nuanced experience to be put into an either or kind of thinking pattern. It's also important that we recognize that members of oppressed groups often accept and believe those negative beliefs that are imposed upon them, which causes serious harm to them, both as individuals and as groups. And as well, it's also important to recognize that oppression creates our position in society, something known as our positionality, which is based on the amount of power and privilege. So we need to be aware of our own power and privilege that we bring into relationships with other people and what that might mean in terms of our dynamics. So Anne Bishop, who's a famous author, activist, and social worker, stated we are oppressors in some parts of our identity and oppressed in others. What do you think she meant by that? Part of what Anne was looking at was the intersectionality of our identities. In some aspects of our identity, we represent those or belong to groups who are marginalized. And in some aspects of our identity, we represent groups that have been that have contributed to other people's oppression. Maybe not individually, but at least in terms of who we represent. So when we look at oppression, that's why it's important we look at it not as a binary, you're only an oppressor or you're only someone who's oppressed, but that based on the intersectionality and the complexity of our identities, we can be both, and most of us are. So next, consider the nature of oppression as it relates to intersectionality. So we have intersectional axes of both oppression and privilege that people experience in their lives and groups experience. And these are axes that reflect the ism prism that you're going to read about in your chapter. They're interconnected and they should never be viewed as separate from one another. And you can experience, and most people do experience, both in their lives, either concurrently or at the same time. And so finally, we look at the nature of oppression as multidimensional. And we use a 4-level model that you can experience oppression at a personal level, where individual attitudes, beliefs, biases, and actions can perpetuate oppression. You can experience oppression at an interpersonal level, which is interaction between individuals, where their words or their actions or the relationships between them are oppressive. You can experience oppression at an institutional level. So institutions are things like our schools, our hospitals, our families. These are all social institutions, and they have written and unwritten rules, policies, procedures, and practices within them that can perpetuate oppression. And then finally, we can look at oppression at its widest level, which is at a cultural level, which is where a large group of people share beliefs, values, norms, and social narratives that perpetuate oppression over time. So it's important when you're looking at forms of oppression that you're able to distinguish between stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. So when we look at this diagram here, we know that a stereotype is based on a cognitive process where we categorize or we label people, and it's something that we think about. So if we're looking at the picture of the person in the middle of the circle here, and we look at the color of their hair, if we're using a negative stereotype, we might say, I think that all people with blue hair are weird. But this can lead to prejudice. So those thoughts become often internalized, and we begin to feel that stereotype. So this is something that occurs at what we call the affective level. And you begin to ask yourself, what are my attitudes towards them? Often based on what you think from a stereotype that becomes now how you feel. And so you might say to yourself, I don't like people with blue hair. Neither stereotypes nor prejudice are illegal, but they do lead to discrimination, which is illegal, and that becomes the action. Right? And so important to think about stereotype as thinking, prejudice as feeling, and discrimination as how you act towards a group of people. So if you're an employer, if you took that prejudice and morphed it into an action, it would be, I'm not going to hire that person because they have blue hair. So this is a very famous poster campaign. It was actually a Halloween poster campaign that came out of a group of students against racism at a large university in Ohio in the United States. And the slogan they used is, "We're a culture, not a costume." And so it looked at the ways in which very negative stereotypes, the way people think, might translate into how people feel, that then might result in people actually portraying through Halloween costumes those stereotypes and that prejudice, and often in negative ways, so that people react to that stereotype and that prejudice as a form of discrimination. So when we look at the different types of discrimination, there are intentional acts of discrimination, which are overt, people intend them to be discriminatory, versus those which are unintentional. So people may discriminate without the motivation to harm somebody. So for example, if there's an older building without accessible entrances, it may be that somebody isn't intentionally discriminating. They just never thought about the ways in which that older building might not be accessible to everyone. But what's important to remember, particularly if someone is found guilty of discrimination, is that a legal finding of discrimination is based on effect, not intent. So what that means is, when a judge is sitting there, they don't really care whether you intentionally or unintentionally discriminate against someone. All that matters is, did that result in discrimination or the effect of discrimination against a person? Another type of discrimination is direct versus indirect. So an example of direct discrimination, not hiring somebody because of a disability. An example of indirect discrimination is often rules that people put in place or policies that they put in place that appear to be universal, but in fact have the effect of discriminating against a particular group. Take, for example, a workplace that implements a dress code that prohibits traditional religious attire, like a hijab or a turban, when there's no safety or operational challenges present. Even though it tries to implement what it appears to be perhaps a universal policy around dress, it still has the effect of being discriminatory against certain individuals or groups of people. Systemic discrimination is discrimination that's deeply embedded unfair treatment and oppression. It's widespread across the society, across groups. It's structural, it can be historical, not always overt. Sometimes it's hidden. Institutional discrimination are practices and policies or procedures within organizations or social institutions that result in unequal treatment of certain groups based on protected characteristics. So sometimes they can be intentional or unintentional or policy driven. Next, we're going to take a look at some of the different forms of discrimination. So we looked at types, and now we're going to take a look at forms. And one of the first forms talked about in Chapter 2 are microaggressions. And they're divided into subcategories of micro-assaults, micro-insults, and micro-invalidations. But microaggressions are those tiny, daily, repeated things that people say or they do that are discriminatory. Sometimes people will say, "Oh, you speak like a white girl." Or they'll say, "Oh, you're so brave because you have a disability." Or they'll say, "Oh, being fat isn't a disability." Or things like, "Well, you're too pretty to be a doctor." All of those are examples of microaggressions. The next form of discrimination talked about in the textbook is bullying. Many different types of bullying, but acts of bullying are illegal under the criminal code. And we've used in the textbook the story of Amanda Todd, daughter of Carol Todd, who took their life based on severe cyberbullying, physical bullying, verbal bullying, psychological bullying. The third form of discrimination that we talk about in the textbook is harassment. And harassment involves comments that aren't welcome or behavior that isn't welcome based on any one of the protected grounds within any human rights code within Canada or a province or a territory. So examples might be inappropriate or insulting remarks or gestures or jokes or innuendos. It could be bullying of any kind. It could be unwanted questions or comments about an employee's private life. It could be gossiping or spreading rumors, or it could be displaying or circulating offensive pictures or materials in any format. So the fourth form of discrimination discussed is poison environment, often in a workplace. A workplace may become hostile or intimidating, or there may be offensive behavior that interferes with an employee's ability to perform their work safely and effectively. The fifth is bias-based profiling. So many of you may have heard about racial profiling, but bias-based profiling is any type of profiling based on supposed safety and security, but really based on some aspect of a person's identity. So for example, if a private security guard follows a shopper because of the assumption that young teenage girls are more likely to shoplift than other people, that's an example of bias-based profiling. Finally, hate crimes. Hate crimes are a crime based on any one of the protected grounds within the human rights codes, and they are also listed in the Canadian Criminal Code. So for example, an anti-Semitic threat that's graffitied on the home of a Jewish family is an example of a hate crime. There are a number of different legal protections and human rights codes within Canada that protect people against discrimination on enumerated grounds. One of those is the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The other is the Canadian Human Rights Act. And the third, which is put into one group, are each province and territory have their own human rights legislation. So throughout your textbook, we put in some important days of significance or days of remembrance that are recognized in Canada. One of these is the Human Rights Day. It's a day to promote a more inclusive and just society by raising awareness and promoting action for equitable practices. You can visit the website on the United Nations Human Rights Day website in order to get more information. In Canada and throughout the world, it's celebrated on December 10th on an annual basis. The Canadian Human Rights Museum has some interesting online resources if you're interested in learning more. So we created this metaphor called the ism prism, which uses the refraction of light through a glass prism. So if you were to take an aspect of someone's identity, whether it's age or race or class or ability, and you shine that beam of light through a prism of oppressive power within a society, that light refracts into many different types of light in a spectrum. And the same way, we use that metaphor to look at how those aspects of identity refract into things like racism, ableism, sexism, ageism, heterosexism. So all isms, and we call it therefore the ism prism. So a whole portion of chapter 2 is a section on isms. And what's important when we look at all the different forms of discrimination that end with ism is that this is not the oppression Olympics. One form of oppression and one form of discrimination is not more important than another, does not deserve more attention than the other. All are important, all need to be eradicated, and many times the different forms of oppression are in fact intersectional. So for example, you'll see in the little graph there, if we look at people who are discriminated against based on their Indigenous identity, that might result in discrimination arising from colonialism, Eurocentrism, cultural imperialism, or racism. If we were looking at discrimination based on race, for example, We might see forms of discrimination as racism, shadeism, or colorism. And in the final section of Chapter 2, we look at the 5 key principles of anti-oppressive practice. The first, understanding the nature of oppression as complex, as dynamic, and as multidimensional. Second is confronting the experiences of privilege and oppression at individual, structural, and as a historic experience. Third, we need to have uncomfortable conversations about why oppression exists. Part of that involves cultivating critical consciousness and awareness. And finally, in order to be an anti-oppressive practitioner, we need to learn the strategies for engaging in concrete action to create social change. When we look at some of those strategies at a personal level, it might be journaling about ways that privilege and oppression have impacted your lived experience. You might engage in reflective practice or reflexive practice. You might engage in educational strategies like taking a course like this, or engaging in some training, reading a book, watching a documentary. You might also engage in interpersonal strategies that could include things like using inclusive language that we look at in each of the chapters in the textbook. It might be engaging in dialogue with your friends and families about privilege and oppression. It's certainly about challenging discrimination when you are a witness to it. And it's also about being a good ally and what that entails. Third, some of the strategies at an institutional level to create change might be joining a committee. It might be practicing allyship within the workplace. Or it might be supporting institutional and organizational change initiatives looking at promoting equity, inclusion, and belonging. And finally, it might be engaging as a change agent that organizes campaigns with broad reach, that actively works to create safer, inclusive, and brave spaces in communities and broader society where all members of equity-deserving groups can feel comfortable learning, working, living, sharing, and growing. Just some of the many strategies that you can look at as an anti-oppressive practitioner.